right. Hi, everyone. Welcome and happy Friday. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Sarah Blagden, and I'm with Dallas Art Fair and Culture Place. I hope you all are enjoying the platform. We are excited to have art advisor Jennifer Klos and artists Billy Hassell and Jules Buck-Jones with us today. Jules has works on the platform through Conduit Gallery and Billy through William Campbell Contemporary Art, two galleries we are thrilled to have on Culture Place. I'd like to introduce Jennifer, who is a Dallas-based art advisor, lecturer, and independent curator. She is the founder of Collector House, a boutique art advisory firm that educates emerging to seasoned collectors on acquiring art through gallery visits, travel tours, online webinars, and a YouTube video series. Jennifer earned a bachelor's degree in history of art and French from Vanderbilt University and a master's degree in the history of decorative arts, design, and culture from the Bard Graduate Center in New York. She holds degrees from the Inchbald School of Design, London, as well as Christie's Education, London. Serving for 8 years as curator at the Oklahoma City Museum of Art, she has worked closely with artists on contemporary art exhibitions and acquisitions. Before we begin, I want to encourage everyone to type any questions in the Q&A or reach out directly after the talk. So with that, Jennifer, I will hand it over to you to introduce and speak with Jules and Billy. I hope you all enjoy.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Sarah, and thank you to Culture Place and the Dallas Art Fair for this great opportunity to get to speak with you this afternoon. We have seen over the past months during this such unique time in 2020 during the global pandemic and COVID-19 that truly for our ways to connect to the art world and to continue these really important talks and fun and interesting ways to learn about art have truly gone online. So thank you for joining us today here on Zoom. So we are going to have a lively and I hope inspiring discussion about landscape and particularly the flora and fauna of what we see and truly what Billy and Jules will give us these insights into what they see as nature. So I'm gonna flip through a couple slides and then we're going to have this as a somewhat informal conversation. And as Sarah mentioned, please type in any questions in the Q&A and or jot down any thoughts you have. So so here we go. So here is going to be, I think, our hour-long, 45 minutes to an hour-long look at what the world we live in today in this in the natural sphere. Okay. So as Sarah mentioned, I just like to introduce my curatorial background to everyone. I have a very diverse past 20 years in the art world where actually speaking to artists is at the core of what I love to do, and certainly connecting artists' work with clients today. So it's a wonderful opportunity to get to continue to share my own interests in nature. So I want to place us in a context. You know, as art historians, we want to think about what's happening in the world we live in today and how we're looking at what artists are creating. Here, I've pulled this quote from National Geographic, and both of our artists here today may mention National Geographic, but really these articles have come out saying it has become our sanctuary, the calming power of nature in a pandemic. And that's actually how I chose this topic today, is I find that when so many of us have been in isolation, and maybe you do have a backyard or a nearby park, or even going to a national park has been something important to you in nature. So I find that this topic is certainly relevant today, and I hope that everyone else can sort of envision yourself in that idyllic place in nature, or if you love to bird watch, if you're thinking about that today, and we're going to link that to art and the meaning of art and really living with art today. So a little personal note, I've been going on many walks in my neighborhood. These are the two guinea hens, the guinea fowl, who live on my street. And I'm just giving you a personal look at how nature has inspired me, not only to be outside, and also it has actually been a way to connect with other neighbors, and certainly these animals that have sort of become my co-workers, so to speak, on my street. So everyone stops to look at them. So I think we're going to talk about animals and plants and how that relates today. So just a brief word about Culture Place. It is such a unique and nice opportunity for what they've done on the website. So I encourage you, if you are new to Culture Place, it's launched just in July with about 18 galleries now in Texas. And I encourage you to go on and look to see what other galleries have to offer on this platform, this digital marketplace, and of course the related programming that will be going on. So this is how I found these two works on Culture Place. Jules Buck Jones's work here with Conduit Gallery that we will be speaking in detail about, and then Billy Hassell's work here with William Campbell Fine Art, Contemporary Art. So I recently placed one of Jules's piece. I've included a couple images, and you can go to my Instagram to see in this corporate client just 2 weeks ago. So it was really literally bringing in and being inspired by this work. And I think it so well fits this incredible lobby space and really brings a whole new sense of imagination and sense of nature into the space. So we'll be getting to hear a little bit more about that. So that's the before picture. Okay, I'm going to now join back in with each artist. And so I'd like to say, we'll start with Jules. Can you tell us a little bit about where you are today and how this pandemic has changed your life, or maybe hasn't changed your everyday life, and tell us a little bit about where you are.
Sure. First of all, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be part of this conversation. Thanks to Billy and Jennifer and Sarah. So, well, my name is Jules Jones, and right now I'm in my studio here in Wimberley, Texas. I've been in Austin for the past 15 years, and last September, my wife and I decided that we've kind of hit our, come to the end of of that experience, and decided that we needed a little bit more nature. So we moved out to Wimberley, which has been fantastic, definitely delivering on plants, animals. I mean, even the skies are different here. So that's been great. And so we sort of isolated ourselves from our community in East Austin and from our friends in a way. And then this pandemic hit. We found ourselves, even more isolated than we thought. The spring we were planning on, a lot more community activity, friends and family. But so, my art practice has sort of took a hit too, with the hit of, with the limitations of seeing people. I don't know, the collective trauma, I think, that the world is experiencing through the pandemic, and through a real reckoning of social justice. I found that like my productivity kind of came to a halt, and which is okay. I typically work in large ebbs and flows of very productive to less productive. So this is kind of my natural cycle. And I typically, when this happens, I try to use these moments where it's not really flowing to read more, to look more, to do other things, to kind of fill my time and, feed my productive practice. So only recently has the pen and paper kind of come back out and started coming back, and behind me are some new works that have been kind of happening. So I feel like I'm coming out of a personal, reflective time, or a time where I just felt an impasse of productivity. So that's me in a nutshell.
Well, I think that, a time of reflection is probably, a lot of people experience that, and me personally as well. And, I imagine for for any of us, we've got moments of productivity and not, but I do think we are kind of learning to adapt to this time we're living in. So Billy, how do you feel about, how have you experienced and these past couple months, and where are you today?
Well, I'm in a good place today, but like Jules, I think I went through a period in the beginning of all this, like everyone, kind of coming to terms with, very significant change in the world, like and how we interact with the world. And it's kind of funny. I've talked to a number of artists who have said the same thing, that they kind of kept working, but they were working, one artist described it as working at like glacial, some kind of glacial speed. It's just everything slowed down. That was my experience. It just, the world kind of slowed down, and actually pretty quickly, that was a positive to me. I mean, I think our world moves too fast anyway. And just to walk outside, and for a few weeks when there wasn't much air traffic, there were more birds, the skies were clear. There was like a distinct, at least in the city, like in Fort Worth where I live, distinct improvement in the air quality. I noticed it. It's and I thought, this can't be a bad thing for the planet, to have everything kind of shut down a little bit, for at least, people didn't drive as much, people didn't fly places as much. And I think the other thing that impressed me about that was how, as human beings, I guess, how adaptable we are, that I think people have figured out ways, have had to come up with different solutions to things, but I won't dwell on that. I think for me, my go-to was doing home improvement projects that I'd put off for, months. But like Jules, I kind of shut down creatively for a little while. It was kind of like I needed to assess the situation. And the first thing that came to mind was more survival stuff, like, fix the broken window, or fix, just do the repairs on the house that needed to be repaired. And so finally, I like to play music, and I have a lot of friends that I get together with and play music with. And I realized without that inspiration, I had a really hard time even picking up a guitar. It was kind of, there are certain things that I realized rely a little bit on social interaction. But as far as the studio, it didn't change much, because, I think artists work alone anyway. So the social distancing thing was, that did not represent a big change. And I have a few commissions that had been kind of in the works before this all started. So I knew I had some work lined up, and it's always good for me to have a project or a deadline. And I'm I guess back working pretty much every day now. So it's kind of back in the routine, but it is different. The hard part to me is not physically interacting with people. I have a girlfriend that who actually gave me a spare room in her house to paint in, because my studio's not air conditioned. And so the studio where I am now it's actually in her house. So I have the convenience of AC, which I haven't had before in the summertime. And so it's nice to have a companion, have someone to spend this time with. But I don't know, humans aren't designed to not physically connect with other humans. I think that's just that's the hardest part for me to adjust to.
Yeah, I certainly think so. I think we crave that human connection and need that. And I will say, my question to both of you, though, is that with you, looking at nature so closely in both of your work, and so Jules, how has this? Have you personally observed nature more? Have you been out? And I think you just recently went on a trip. Did this bring you more? Did this bring you closer to your subject matter and your inspiration?
Yeah, and in a lot of ways, and I know this for a lot of friends and family too. The conditions are, for me, a perfect storm to spend more time outdoors observing things. I'm teaching from home. now, I, don't have a lot of, all of my kind of projects were suspended. So it gave me a lot more time, kind of forced me to go outside more, which is something that I prioritize in my life anyway, my day to day, spend time either drawing outside or just being outside, looking at birds, listening. That's part of my everyday thing anyway. But I have found that with the sort of termination of a bunch of projects and a bunch of different tasks I was on the hook for, all of a sudden I found that that window was a lot wider. So yes, it's been really conducive to that for me. And I have a lot of friends I know who maybe don't prioritize it as much now, sort of saying, gosh, I spent some time. I don't know, Billy, you probably get this too, as like an animal guy. You get a lot of friends kind of sending you photographs of birds and saying, oh, you know what this is? Or you know what this butterfly is? Or, you know what this is?
My favorite are like the,
usually I pass it on to my wife.
Oh, I've got a friend in Terlingua who has a little I don't know, watering, it's man-made, but a watering area outside of her house, and she has one of those motion cameras, and she sends me these incredible videos. They're black and white and kind of like almost negative, but they're all the wildlife that comes through at night. So I love that stuff. It's great to get input.
I recently got one of those cameras too. We have a little bird bath, and a couple nights ago, I heard something sounded bigger than a bird. It was dark out, and we had this armadillo up on his hind legs, kind of getting into the bird bath. And he was, this was like before these large rains, and it had been, a thirsty animal for sure. I videotaped him drinking water for 3 minutes straight before he tipped it over and spilled it all over himself.
Yeah, no, I'd like to have one of those. I've sort of created a little nature in my backyard with a pond, and it attracts wildlife. But I'm like right in an old neighborhood in the middle of Fort Worth, and it's like a little backyard oasis. But I was up early this morning, and my dog was outside. I went out to see what the ruckus was, and she was in the pond. And there was a raccoon that had wandered into the yard, I guess came up to the pond, and unfortunately it had a sad end for the raccoon. But like a little wild interaction in the middle of the city, and it was it was the start of my day to day. But I like having a pond just to see a little bit of nature, bringing it into the urban environment that I live in.
I'm looking forward to seeing that raccoon come exist in a painting next.
Well, it'll show up. I'm trying to figure out it's like if you put a bird feeder out, sometimes you attract, hawks, little hawks, Cooper's hawks. So sometimes next to the bird feeder, you'll find a pile of feathers. And I kind of like that. I mean, it's like you kind of wonder to what extent you should interact with, with nature. But, if you're an avid bird watcher, it probably wouldn't be a happy sight to have a songbird eaten right outside your kitchen window by a hawk. But I think the whole drama is all part of it, So, I think the pond is a great source of inspiration for me. So, it's good to have.
And so, Billy, that's a nice sort of segue to talking about how you take these observations from nature, and then how do those become your source material for your animals in the works. So I'm going to pull up an image of one of your sketchbooks, and you may have some there in front of you to share with our group. But could you walk us through sort of in a sense, a typical sort of from beginning to end about how you take these images and then end up becoming, these larger canvases and these compositions?
Yeah. Are you going to pull the image up, or
yep,
should I?
I was going to say I'm going to pull it up right now. So, okay, here it comes. Okay.
Okay, so can I keep talking while this is on?
Yes, that's perfect. If you could just give us some insight into how you, because it really does sound like you use a lot of sketchbooks rather than use some photography, it sounds like.
Yeah, I use my cell phone some to take pictures, but I really rely on drawings. And in this case, this is a watercolor journal, and I've been keeping these for about 20 years, I guess. And they're more sustained. I mean, they're a little more than just sketches, but they're done on site. This was done out in New Mexico, up near Abiquiu. It's a real famous mountain, Cerro Perdonal, that George O'Keeffe painted, and it became a subject of a lot of her work. But it's a very iconic part of that northern New Mexico landscape, and you can see it from lots of different approaches just because it's so high. But a friend, Jim Woodson, an artist here in Fort Worth, and his wife bought land out there. And before they built their house, I had a chance to go spend some time and did this watercolor. And then the watercolor journals, this is about a maybe 6 inches, 6 by 8 inch, watercolor journal. It's a really nice one though. It has heavy paper, and I'll take something like this and turn it into an oil painting. And I think I sent an image of the finished oil painting, but I'll frequently take a watercolor sketch like that's done from life, like a plein air watercolor, and then I'll populate it with, in this case, just the one owl. I kind of wanted the mountain was so iconic that I wanted some image of a bird, some image that I consider pretty iconic. I think owls are really amazing, and they almost don't seem like birds to me. They seem like something bigger than that. But so this is a 5 by 6 foot oil painting, and it's actually now, I think, through Adair Margot Gallery, it got placed in the American Embassy in Mexico City. So it's not in the United States anymore, but it I guess in a way a New Mexico scene that was appropriate for that, in a way. But that's one way I approach it. And sometimes I'll just take a picture with my cell phone of a distinctive landscape feature and bring it back, and develop a watercolor study from that, or I'll develop that into an oil painting too. And but that's kind of, I typically rely more on drawings I've made or watercolors I've made than photography, but I do rely on photographic sources for the wildlife, the birds. And I mean, you see wildlife when you're out, but it's rare that you get time to actually draw something. Most of the time it's a fleeting experience. They're there and then they're gone, or they don't stay still long enough to do a drawing. And so I do use, I have old field guides and old National Geographics, and I typically like the old, very stylized images of wildlife rather than I don't know. I sort of treat the animals and birds as signifiers almost more than some kind of descriptive portrait of a thing. But that's a pretty common approach, going from a drawing to a watercolor, or a watercolor to an oil painting, and then one thing typically leads to another that way.
I like that. I think that's a nice example of showing you've taken an identifiable terrain, so to speak, and then really kind of brought it to life, but then also chosen just the one owl to include, which I think is sort of impactful and meaningful. And so you sent one more recent one, it sounds like, with this.
This is actually a commission. We're probably jumping the gun on this, but I'm in the midst. The painting behind me in the studio where I am now is this painting. I mean, this is a watercolor. It's about 8 inches by, I don't know, maybe 12 inches roughly. And when I do commissions, I usually do a really detailed watercolor study. Well, I do a drawing first, and usually at the drawing stage, the client can decide, if it looks good to go on, and I'll do the watercolor. And I do that so that I can eliminate as much, surprises, I guess, for the viewer, except being surprised at how nice the final oil painting looks. But I get a lot of the information is pretty well figured out with the watercolors. And this is primarily commissions. I do this way. I don't do, preliminary watercolors for every oil painting I do. But this is a piece I'm doing for a client, Fort Worth, that came through the William Campbell Gallery. And I'm about, 80% through the oil painting now. And doing the oil painting is just really fun. But a lot of the creativity, I guess, if you could call it that, happens at the watercolor stage, because it's when I compose. And in this case, this is Mitre Peak in West Texas. It's just south of Fort Davis on the road down to Alpine. And I was there in February, and I took a couple of pictures with my cell phone. It was raining the day that I drove past it, so I didn't stop to watercolor it. And the pictures were just silhouettes almost, because it was a really gray day. But it was enough to kind of study the topography and figure out, I wanted the landscape part of it to be as distinctive and identifiable as possible. And the foreground, I took all kinds of liberties, obviously, with the wildlife, and but even with the flora and fauna, they're probably from the middle of the painting down, about where the painted bunting is down, is a composition that's completely invented. So I take liberties when it comes to the overall composition, particularly the foregrounds. But I like a sense of place. I like the general location of the painting to be an identifiable place most of the time when I'm doing landscape-based paintings, which I don't always do. But this is a current piece I'm working on right now.
This is great, and I think our audience can definitely see, how well developed you can do experiment with your color and composition at the watercolor level. So, which I think is great. So we're going to transition back to Jules. Yep. And talk about watercolor and a little bit about your practice. So, can you place us into a context of, from even going back to your childhood and then even today, did you experiment with painting and watercolor and ink when you were quite young, and then all through college and graduate school?
Yeah, both of my parents were artists, so we had a lot of art materials laying around for me to experiment with as a youth. And in art school, I was in the painting program at VCU in Richmond, and I've always just had a relationship with paper. I've always found panels and canvas works. That's never really been the right fit for me. So I've always made works on paper. And for a long time, I was using kind of watered down acrylics, washes, and inks. And once I started teaching watercolor at Texas State in San Marcos, did I really start adopting, watercolor itself as a media that I'm using in tandem with the inks and other acrylics. I've always been sort of a, whatever it takes to make it type of, in terms of my toolbox. So I have, every type of drawing tool. You can imagine pastels, paint markers, graphites and charcoals, and then a wide range of water soluble media. So I got, inks and watercolors and gouache and acrylics. And I just sort of use them, as I need. So I use the washes for when I need kind of to build up kind of transparent layers. If that's like the kind of like the background of this painting here. And then I'll use more opaque media like my acrylics and my inks in order to sort of, pile or omit or sort of break up the picture plane. But yeah, so I've been kind of making these works on paper, whether they're drawings or paintings, I don't know, or really care. They kind of go back and forth between those two, departments pretty constantly.
And then, so does that really, make you feel sort of freer to use the paper in that sense, but probably you may have to work more quickly. Your work is quite gestural, so I think of it would be kind of a push and pull of sort of thinking ahead to what your composition is going to be, but also sort of working quickly. Is that the case?
Yeah, I think the paper, I do work fast. I mean, I have a hard time slowing down. I have to sort of, put like obstacles in my path in order to prevent, me from just overworking everything. But the paper is, I find it very liberating because I can have an idea, tear off a sheet of paper and sort of get going on it, all in an afternoon, sometimes even completing certain things. So I find paper to be like I find it the most, conducive to my style. I also don't shy away from, collaging different paintings or drawings together. Sometimes I'll have a couple paintings or drawings, let's say 2 different paintings or drawings going on in the studio, neither of which are really kind of achieving what I want them to. And sometimes I will take an X-Acto blade or sort of scissors and sort of take what I want from painting A and take what I like from painting B and sort of fuse them together to create some, to arrive at maybe what I was thinking about all along. I tend to work in series too. So I'll be working on 5 to 6 to a dozen different things at the same time. So, which, for me is great. It's a way I can sort of continue working while other things are drying. I just kind of don't stop and start from the beginning. And so sometimes though, that can bifurcate my direction. So sometimes I'm making a single concept, but on 7 different paintings. And so sometimes collaging them back together is the kind of like the right path.
Yeah, as your result. I'm going to share my screen again to show some of the larger pieces that you had sent me, and along with your book. I love your book, your Wild book, and how you came up and it really documented the whole process. So maybe you can walk us through some of these images.
Yeah, well, these are just some, these are just these are sketches. So I tend to work pretty large. And then I'll use like a 9x12 sheet of paper more as sort of ideas. So here I'm just trying to break down, use a serpent almost as like these gestures and breaking them down into kind of other symbols, but using, serpentine scale markings or things that like I observe either through nature or, my field guides, like Billy was saying, I use a lot. There's my puppy. He's always sitting on my paintings. But I'm really obsessed with mark making, and I think that like what you'll see in some of these large canvas works and even in the other work is that I'm taking whatever the imagery is, whether it's feathers, scales, or fur, or whether it's the canopy of a tree or the bark, or just the way the kind of light moves through a forest. I take all that information and kind of boil it down to like its basics and then sort of recombine them where my landscapes and the figures or the subjects, typically animals, sometimes plants, sometimes something other, they tend to kind of camouflage themselves at times. And so you have, I like that tension where the subjects are kind of melting or hiding into the background and then emerging at different speeds. And my process is really improvisational. So this is the painting that's behind me right now. And at this point, I just had this large I just wanted to do this wild sort of landscape. I had no idea what was going to sort of live on top of that landscape or what the scene was going to be or what the subject was going to be. And it was kind of hard, but here I am just sort of desperately, this is me like when I'm not really in this time during this pandemic where I felt a little slowed down. I'm just sort of propping I'm pinning other drawings to it, seeing, is this it? Or this is one of the backgrounds to one of the wood pieces that I made that you placed. This is the negative space, sort of seeing like, ooh, maybe this is it. So I'm just like, kind of taking everything in my studio, leaning it up, on painting just to kind of get a sense of what it is that this painting needs. It was sort of a different way of working. These are these different wooden cutouts on another sort of abstract background. And there it is. That's the whole thing. So yeah, I have these wooden cutouts I'm working with, which have been really fun way to paint and work, which are nice. And then again, with my works on paper.
With the works
But the shaped panels are really fun. Pretty interesting way to work. A little different, which is exciting, challenges me in new ways.
Yeah, I would think it would present its own new challenges to you, but it's great to see these studio shots, to see sort of where you start and where you begin. And I love this collage effect where you're really taking materials and images and putting them together and creating a new dialogue. So I think that really helps tell the story and tell a narrative. So really my next question is, and it really actually stems along one of the Q&A questions we have. We have two questions. How has the time of reflection or pause changed your work? And then a second question, which was on my list to ask you all as well, is your thought of Texas landscape, the sort of history of the way we look at artists who have depicted the Texas landscape, and also how you see yourself fitting into it. Because I do think that there is such an interesting lineage to the way we've looked at history, the history of art, and particularly in Texas over the past, well, several hundred years. So, so Billy, how do you see yourself in depicting nature? And even in a sense of realism, you are capturing real animals and often sometimes these real landscapes, these real scenic pictorial landscapes. How do you feel about that?
Well, I think what's interesting, I don't consider myself a landscape painter per se, but I do love going out and watercoloring the landscape. And I mean, so I spent the last few days out on the Brazos River, and it's just like show and tell. But so I do these drawings. I have a friend that's got some land, and I love sitting out and doing, watercolors of the river. And these were all the Brazos, all within about I don't know, 10-mile distance. Some of the same views at different times of the day. And that's one part of my working process. And I love seeing the studio shots of Jules. I take pictures in my studio, and I wish I'd send a few of those to you, because it is kind of like it's like a view of inside your brain, like your thought process. But as far as the landscape, the Texas landscape, I went away. I grew up in Texas. I was born in Dallas and moved away when I went to college, and I was gone for more or less, I guess, back and forth for 10 years or so. And it wasn't really until I moved back to Texas after college that I learned about the early Texas painters, like from Dallas, there's like the Dallas 9, the number varies, but artists like Jerry Bywaters and Otis Dozier and Alexander Hogue, who left Texas to go back to Oklahoma, and then living in Fort Worth for the last 20 years, there's a Fort Worth circle that's also a very interesting and very distinct group of painters that were all working in the 30s and 40s and early 50s, but mostly in the 30s and 40s during the Depression era. And what's interesting to compare the two is the Dallas painters, primarily, a lot of them were landscape-based painters. I mean, they did some genre, and they all did a variety of things, but it's the Fort Worth circle had a lot more, I don't know, European influence, I think. I mean, there's a lot more abstraction. You see a lot of the influence of Cubism, I would say more so in the Fort Worth circle than you do in the Dallas 9, the early Dallas. But the early Texas, I had the great fortune when I was young, through a friend, Martin Delabano in Dallas, who's has been a friend of mine since we met back in the early 80s. We grew up not very far from each other, both kind of near White Rock Lake. But his dad, Barney Delabano, was a contemporary with those early Dallas artists. And So through Martin, I met Otis Dozier, and we actually worked together at Peregrine Press for a short time before he passed away. He was doing his last series of lithographs. And at that point, I kind of realized that I am sort of part of that lineage. You know, I'm, you know, and now I'm 60 something years old. And, but I had, you know, I feel a direct link to that tradition. And I never thought of myself as a traditional painter particularly, although I do a lot of work that is, you know, in many ways is very traditional. But it's always sort of about pushing, like there's this great Bob Dylan quote. He says, you know, I'm not really writing new songs. I'm just using the same piece of wood looking for new places to drive nails into it. You know, it's kind of like taking all that material and that history and doing something that's fresh and, you know, like a new look to it. But I think it has given me a kind of a deeper appreciation of the Texas landscape from that perspective. And so I guess I'm not as afraid to embrace landscape painting as I might have once been. But it's, you know, it's, I think that's an important thing for me to feel connected to that tradition.
Yeah, I think so. And I think that's how we can look at the meaning of your own work. So I commend you on that. And I think you are really being written into this history of the way we look at plants and animals and how we look at this particular subject matter, because it is identifiable, but yet it really is something that is still uniquely your own and uniquely contemporary. You're both, I think both of you have your own really unique style in the way you approach your materials and composition. So Jules, how do you see yourself in this sort of bigger realm of art history and the way we're looking at the history of landscape? You're really bridging this idea of realism, but also sort of the supernatural.
Yeah, and you know, I have a caliber of, I sort of categorize my, you know, artistic influences, you know, in my mind, usually because I use them as examples for people I'm looking at for my students too. And so I always have, like, you know, the people working with the natural sciences, whether that's, you know, pictorial imagery, or whether that's more kind of conceptually driven, you know, and then I have the, you know, people who I kind of relate to more aesthetically, or process wise. And sometimes those two camps aren't always the same thing. There's few artists who do sort of bridge the gap, like Terry Winters and Philip Taffy, which aren't Texas people, but kind of, for me, I find them like in the middle of this, interested in sort of natural imagery, but I find their, like, you know, aesthetic delivery kind of much more in tune with what I'm kind of interested in. But in terms of Texas people, you know, I moved to Texas in 2005 to go to graduate school. And one of the reasons I chose Austin was to work with Melissa Miller, who I, you know, was a fan of, or was brought to my attention when I was an undergrad. So working with Melissa Miller at UT was, you know, very formative for, you know, where my work has gone since then, which was now 15 years ago. But also, you know, I also learned about a lot of, so, you know, coming to Texas, I wasn't super familiar with a ton of Texas-based artists, but, you know, working at the university and then also collaborating with Flatbed Press in Austin, I learned about a lot of artists of the region kind of working with similar kind of content, like Frank X. Tolbert. I think, you know, his, you know, work on, you know, Birds of America kind of aligned with a lot of projects, you know, that I work with. But so, oh yeah, I mean, and also in Fort Worth, gosh, what's the, I can't remember the name.
Helen Altman?
No.
Not Helen.
But anyway, I find myself, you know, kind of existing in these two worlds, sort of interested in, you know, thirsty for people working with the same type of content, like looking at Billy Hassell's work. I mean, I see like, there's such an impressive and control and delivery. And I feel very privileged to, be a colleague. And then, yeah, so anyway, that's a short answer, but.
No, but I think that that's nice for you to be inspired, once you've arrived at UT, to be inspired by others that are around you, and certainly your everyday, your inspiration there in Wimberley that you have of the actual wildlife and, that are really inspiring your compositions now. Well, so my next question is really relating to how we look at, the earth right now and in terms of conservation. And so how you see this as more sort of documenting these particular animals and the way we look at the earth now, really from a point of view of conservation. So Billy, do you see this as sort of documenting ways of documenting particular animals and birds within this history?
Well, this is interesting. Jules and I talked a little bit about this when we did that the interviews for Conduit Gallery. I think on the one hand, Jules raised a really interesting question about the beauty, like making things really lush and beautiful. And I do kind of default to that. I think, it's interesting. I think when I was younger, starting out, I think my work was a lot more spontaneous and sort of reactive. I'd throw something up on the canvas and I'd react to it. And it had a raw quality. And I think over the years, I've become more and more refined in the way I approach things. And part of that is because of projects I've done for the Nature Conservancy, where I've been commissioned to do a print or a series of prints for Audubon. And I thought I was an unlikely candidate for an organization like that, because I think of them as being, like artists who really specialize in that kind of representational, depictions of birds and wildlife. I think it's interesting that Jules and I are both probably somewhat influenced by James John Audubon, being a painter and an outdoorsman, and just the whole history of like natural history painters like Louis Agassiz, and but our approach is so different, and I kind of admire that the looseness and the intuitive quality that Jules' work has. But I think, and I kind of digressing a little bit, but back to conservation, I think yes, I do want to document the world as I see it, and the certain aspects are definitely exaggerated and intensified, like the color. And like this painting behind me, you'd never see all that wildlife in one place at one time, unless you were at a natural history museum and it was a diorama that was designed to just show you all the animals that live in this place. But, and in that sense, I think we kind of take the same liberties of putting in whatever we want. And, it's there's a sort of an honesty about it. I try to be accurate when it comes to flora and fauna. But as far as the world, I do think we're living in a really critical time. And I'm not sure we can reverse the trends. I think I'm very skeptical of a lot of, the information that we have that's out there. I think that the planet's going through some things that it would go through anyway. I think humans do have an impact on it. I think that if at best, I think depicting these things and kind of celebrating them in a way at least makes people aware of them, and maybe aware of how kind of critical and fragile it all is. Because I don't think, I think it's real easy to take for granted that, this stuff's going to be around forever. And I just don't think that's the case. I think, just in my lifetime, I've seen things disappear, from just the creeks and rivers and lakes around where I've grown up. And if not disappear, just dwindle, to an alarming, point. Even turtles. Turtles are, used to be, and you still see them, but even, not like you used to, not the varieties that used to be around when I was a kid. So there's a real, to me, a kind of I don't know, a heaviness about the reality of what we're living through. But it's also, for me, I'm super grateful to have the opportunity to live on this planet while there is still all this diversity and beauty. And I guess if art can have any kind of impact, even in terms of making people aware of what's out there, it could have ultimately a bigger positive impact. I'm not sure how much we can reverse or change or fix, but at least make people aware of it and appreciate it while they can.
And Jules, how do you see, your art in your own artistic practice inspired by this natural world around us where things are changing, in terms of the way we may be seeing animals and not, or our vegetation changing?
Yeah. I mean, I definitely want to infuse some sort of, tension in my work. I'm an optimistic guy. I'm a real positive guy if you meet me. But I have some, serious fears about the natural world. And that those fears come out in my paintings and drawings. So while I do think that there's a celebratory aspect to my work, and I do believe that, there's a benefit to that element. So, celebratory, also educational, or just awareness. Getting people to give a shit would be so huge. But the work itself kind of there is sort of I think there's a darkness, there's a sharpness to some of the work. I want the work to sort of to have a element of danger or or tension there that is a little bit uneasy, something that's not just, I don't know, passive. So anyway, I try to do that either with the language that I'm kind of articulating the background with, or sometimes I do that with the subject matter. I think there's a fine line between being like making preachy artwork and making work that is kind of powerful. And, I think that if it's too on the nose, it feels a little too maybe propaganda. And I don't think either of us are in that ballpark, but I also sometimes I find like maybe the paintings that, I don't know sometimes what they're doing or who is actually looking at these or being impacted by them. So I have a side project called Animal Facts Club that me and my wife do, and a group of friends, and we do big kind of puppet shows and we put out publications. And I use that whole sort of, side project as a place where I can be very didactic. I can be very sort of, I can put in educational elements. I know who my audience is because we get grants from the city of Austin to put on performances for, different groups. So, I think like that's like where I feel like good. I feel like I'm okay, great. I can kind of educate there, right? I can educate like directly. I can call attention to direct specific things like, environmental and conservation and everything. So for me, like I like kind of having those two different creative practices where and that allows me to be a lot more sort of mysterious or poetic in my paintings, because I feel like I am kind of getting everything else off my chest in these other, more straightforward ways. But it's all about connecting people. I think like, connecting people, getting people to, acknowledge some of the bad things, but also just like, if you could just adore some of like the beautiful parts too. I mean, I don't know. I don't have the answer, but.
Well, and I do think you've touched upon something. I mean, I think that with each of your work, people can see the sort of personal, and there's an emotional side to the way they see images of nature, and I think they're thought-provoking, and it kind of takes you into this other realm of, well, the way we've looked at art throughout the past several hundred years in terms of the sublime and the picturesque, and we could get into a lot of big ideas about the way we look at nature. But I do think, just from a standpoint of the way we look at just contemporary art today, that, you know, you all are playing a really unique and important role in contemporary art, by showing images of, by really creating your own images of nature. So, well, in our final time here, I have one quick question for both of you. So I always love to give this question to artists, because I think it tells us a little bit about your personality. But if you were to create your own little imaginary dinner party, and you had to pick the location, and then, you know, these guests could be real people, they could be people from history, but they could also be animals as well. So where would your ideal little gathering be, and who would you invite there? So Billy?
Oh boy, that's an interesting question.
How big is the table?
Yeah. And I'm not actually limiting you. Sometimes I tell people, if you could only invite two guests, but, you know, we could sit and talk about this for all afternoon. No, table can be quite big.
Oh, I think this reminds me of a question once that someone asked about, like, if you could live in any time in history and be whoever. I had a quick response for that, and as I would have been the illustrator on the SS Beagle, you know, for like Darwin, going around with illustrating all of the flora and fauna he gathered. But I'd say it'd be fun to sit down at a table with John James Audubon and some of the early Texas artists. I did get to talk to Otis Dozier, but he told a story once about how, you know, when he was alive, like if an artist traveled somewhere and came back, everyone wanted to talk to him because we didn't have the immediate information. The only way you got information was from talking to people, you know, interacting with people. I'd probably invite a coyote to join us, but it'd have to be a talking coyote since we're working in the realm of fantasy here. I just, you know, I think that's an interesting idea, you know, a banquet, you know, with all your favorite, you know, people alive or dead, and a few animal spirits to contribute. But I don't know. There are a few people whose brains I'd love to pick if I had the opportunity to. But I'd actually like to sit down with Jules sometime over dinner and visit and talk. You know, because I feel like the only times we've communicated, it's pretty funny, is virtually. You know, we met virtually, and and here we are again having a conversation. So this may be part of the way the world will look in the future, but I do look forward to interacting with people in real time. But
well, I'll repeat to that dinner party, no problem. If you do get that going, I'll be there.
Yeah, that's. One thing, look, I should let Jules answer that question too. I'm curious to hear what that would look like.
Yeah, I would probably set up a reservation at Chenati Hot Springs.
Yeah, I was going to say
Chenati
Hot Springs. It's funny. We were just there.
Okay, they got a big picnic table and in that communal kitchen. And, yep. You know, I've met some wild people just in that communal kitchen who are also at the hot springs at the same time. So that, I think, would be a great space to hold the banquet. I'd like to invite Walter Anderson, who's kind of one of my favorite painters. You know, he's like I don't know if you're familiar. He's from the coast of Mississippi. Yeah. And I love his work so much. I read his biographies that his wife wrote, and I mean, the man is, insane, and like so passionate. And I love these stories of him making these large puppet shows. So I'd invite him. I'd invite Jim Henson. because I mean, of all the people who leave the world too early, I really, Jim Henson's one I just wish could have stayed around a little longer, provided a little bit more kind of magic for people. I'd like another artist I'd want to be there, maybe Charles Birchfield. I'd probably invite Jimi Hendrix. I'd probably invite a whale shark. I'd probably invite Miles Davis and and then I'd probably have to invite my father, or he'd be mad he wasn't invited. And then Billy, and of course Jennifer, you'd be invited as well.
Thank you. This sounds great. And I was going to say, envisioning a picnic table outdoors, because I think really that's the theme of our whole talk today, would be just, captivating and being surrounded by Mother Nature itself. So just checking to see if there are any more questions before we end. Let's see, we've got a question for Jules. It's interesting to see the wood cutouts incorporated in your work. Do you see yourself expanding on the wood cutouts and the sculptural pieces?
Yeah, it's a pretty new kind of direction. And at first I was very excited, and then I started working on them, and I was like, oh, I don't really like this, but mostly that was just because it was different and hard. And I had a commission for one of these pieces, and the person who was commissioning it was like, I don't want you to feel constricted with these. And at first I did, but they start out as large drawings. You might have an image of a couple of them, but I have like these like 8 foot long, tall ink drawings of how I start them. Then I photograph them and I send them to my framer, who's got a 8x10 CNC router that he can cut them out. And he challenged me. He said, look, I got to make circular panels all day, every day for people. Give me the weirdest shapes you can think of. And some of those shapes in that corner, I thought were like pretty challenging, weird shapes. I haven't even finished them all. So I'm also going to use them as framing devices, because working on paper, one thing that's kind of annoying is I have to, framing everything for an exhibit. So all of these you see here, like the square one, that circular one, and then this long that long board are all sort of thoughts that I have about new ways I may try to frame my works on paper. And so, I'm interested in installation and like where drawing and installation kind of meet. So all of those large kind of canvas pieces, how I can kind of really try to transform a space. And I think that there's a lot of room for some of these wood cutouts there too. So yeah, I am kind of working with it, and I'm excited to expand on it and try to figure out my first thing is I always start small, and then my immediate thing is, how do I make this bigger?
How to take it to the large scale. Well, I do think the cutouts create a really nice dimension once they're either placed on the wall. And so I personally am a big fan of them. So, well, I look to see if there are any more questions, and I hope everyone has enjoyed our presentation today. And thank you so much to Billy and Jules for participating today. And I think hopefully leaving our audience with an inspiring look at nature around us, but also particularly your work. So I encourage everybody to go on to Culture Place to look at their 2 works. And if you have any more questions about the presentation, certainly let us know. And I'm going to put up my email address here for you if you have other questions that I can either direct to the artists or to the galleries. So I just appreciate everyone showing up this afternoon. And so find me on Instagram or send me an email, and we look forward to staying in touch. So thank you all so much for participating today.
Well, thank you, Jennifer. And yeah, I'd like to thank Nancy Whiteneck at Conduit Gallery, and William Campbell and Pam Campbell at William Campbell Contemporary Art Fort Worth. And thanks for putting this together. This was great. And it was great to see Jules again.
Absolutely. Yes. Pleasure to be here.
Well, and next time we will set up our own picnic banquet for ourselves once we can start to travel some more. So
yeah, Shinati Hot Springs.
It's a date.
Yeah, it's a date. All right. Thank you all so much.
Thank
you.
you, Jennifer.